The Salisbury Plain, a vast, wind-swept canvas of chalk and grass stretching across the heart of southern England. At its center stands a monument so iconic, so ancient, that it has become the very symbol of human mystery, Stonehenge. For 5,000 years, these silent megaliths have weathered the storms of history, standing as the ultimate testament to a vanished civilization. We have long assumed we knew who they were. We called them the ancient Britons. We imagined them as our direct ancestors, the primal architects of our identity, whose blood still flows through the veins of modern Europeans. But we were wrong. In May 2002, a discovery was made just 3 miles from the Great Stone Circle that would send the first tremors through the foundations of British history. During a routine archaeological excavation in the town of Amesbury, researchers unearthed a grave. It wasn't the simple rustic burial one might expect from the early Bronze Age. This was a king's ransom. Inside the earth lay a man, approximately 40 years of age, surrounded by the richest collection of artifacts ever found from this period in Britain. There were copper knives, flint arrowheads, stone wrist guards to protect against the snap of a bowstring, and most significantly, 2 exquisite gold hair ornaments, the oldest gold ever discovered in the British Isles. He became known to history as the Amesbury Archer. To the public, he was the king of Stonehenge. It was assumed he was a local chieftain, perhaps a high priest or a master architect who oversaw the final phases of the monument's construction. But when the lab results came back from the University of Southampton, the narrative didn't just shift, it shattered. Scientists performed a technique called oxygen isotope analysis on the enamel of the archer's teeth. Our teeth are like biological flight recorders. They absorb the chemical signature of the water we drink while we are growing up. This signature is unique to the geography and climate of the region. Instead, the results pointed thousands of miles away. The Amesbury Archer was not from Britain. He had grown up in the cold, high-altitude regions of Central Europe, likely the alpine foothills of modern-day Switzerland, Germany, or Austria. This was an impossible revelation. How did a man from the heart of the European continent end up buried in the most sacred ground of a distant island, carrying gold and copper technology that the local people had never seen? He arrived at the exact moment the final stones of Stonehenge were being raised into place, but he was different. He looked different, he dressed differently, and most importantly, his genetic legacy was part of a rising tide that was about to wash over the British Isles. For decades, archaeology operated under a comforting assumption that history was a slow, peaceful transition of ideas. We believed that the ancient Neolithic farmers who built the first stages of Stonehenge simply learned new skills from travelers like the archer. We thought they traded their stone tools for copper ones, changed their pottery styles, and carried on as they always had. It was a story of cultural evolution. But the bones of the archer whispered a darker truth. He was a harbinger. He belonged to a mysterious group known as the Bell Beaker people, named for the distinctive bell-shaped drinking vessels found in their graves. As scientists began to sequence the DNA of skeletons across the British landscape, they realized the archer wasn't an isolated traveler. He was the first drop of rain before a massive genomic storm. The people who had spent 2,000 years tilling the soil of Britain, the people who had dragged the massive bluestones from the mountains of Wales and raised the great trilithons of Stonehenge, were about to face an ending so absolute it defies modern comprehension. The investigation into their fate would reveal the greatest cold case in human history. It would prove that the people who stand among the stones today are not the descendants of the builders. They are the descendants of the people who replaced them. To find out what happened to the original masters of Stonehenge, we must look beyond the stones and into the ghost code of the human genome. To understand the scale of the mystery, we must first look at the people who were already there. For over 2,000 years before the Amesbury Archer ever set foot on British soil, the island belonged to a group of people we are only now beginning to truly understand. These were the Neolithic Britons, the masters of the megaliths. Around 4000 BC, a revolutionary wave of migrants arrived in Britain from the Mediterranean by way of continental Europe. These people were the descendants of farmers from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. They were the ones who brought the gift of agriculture to the wind-swept northern islands. They cleared the dense ancient forests with polished stone axes. They introduced cattle, sheep, and pigs, and they brought with them a profound, obsessive connection to the movements of the sun and the stars. Physically, these original builders looked very different from the people we associate with Britain today. Genetic reconstruction of their remains shows they typically had olive skin, dark hair, and deep brown eyes. They were a sophisticated communal society, capable of massive engineering projects that required the coordination of thousands of workers. It was this population that built the sprawling complex of Avebury, the mysterious artificial mountain of Silbury Hill, and the first, most ancient stages of Stonehenge itself. For nearly a century, mainstream archaeology held a very specific view of what happened next. This was known as the pots not people theory. In the mid-20th century, archaeologists observed a sudden and dramatic shift in the artifacts found in British graves around 2500 BC. The traditional simple pottery of the Neolithic farmers was abruptly replaced by the ornate bell-shaped vessels of the beaker culture. Along with these pots came copper daggers, gold ornaments, and a new way of burying the dead in individual mounds called barrows rather than the great communal long barrows of the previous era. To the scholars of the time, this wasn't an invasion. Following the horrors of the World Wars, the scientific community was deeply hesitant to suggest that one group of people had violently replaced another. Instead, they proposed a more peaceful, civilized explanation. They argued that the bell beaker phenomenon was simply a fashion trend, or perhaps a new religion. The theory suggested that the original Neolithic builders of Stonehenge hadn't gone anywhere. They had simply seen the cool new technology from the continent, the copper, the gold, the beautiful pottery, and decided to adopt it. It was seen as a prehistoric lifestyle choice. In this version of history, the people remained the same, but their brand had changed. The builders of the stones were supposedly the same people who eventually became the warriors of the Bronze Age. This narrative was comforting. It suggested a long, unbroken lineage of British identity, stretching back to the very first farmers. It meant that if you were of British descent, your ancestors were the ones who dragged those 80-ton sarsen stones across the landscape. It meant that the blood of the megalith builders was still pumping through the hearts of the modern world. But the story of Stonehenge was about to turn from a tale of peaceful evolution into a story of a silent, total, and terrifying vanishing act. In 2018, the silence of the Salisbury Plain was met with a digital roar from the world's most advanced genetics laboratories. A massive international team, led by researchers from Harvard Medical School and the Natural History Museum in London, published the results of the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted. They had successfully sequenced the genomes of 400 prehistoric Europeans, covering the critical window before, during, and after the arrival of the bell beaker poacher in Britain. The data was not a subtle shift, it was a genomic explosion. The study revealed that between 2500 and 2000 BC, the exact period when the final, most famous stones were being positioned at Stonehenge, the genetic makeup of Britain was almost entirely replaced. Within a span of just a few centuries, 90% of the Neolithic gene pool vanished. The dark-haired, olive-skinned farmers who had built the megaliths, the people who had lived on the island for 2,000 years, were effectively erased from history. This was the death of the pots, not people theory. This was not a fashion trend. This was a total population replacement on a scale that had never been seen in the archaeological record. The Beaker people weren't just bringing new pottery, they were bringing a completely different biological blueprint. Where did this new DNA come from? To find the answer, scientists had to look thousands of miles to the east, to the vast, wind-swept grasslands of the Eurasian Steppe in what is now Russia and Ukraine. This was the homeland of the Yamnaya, a nomadic horse-riding culture that had already swept across much of continental Europe. These were the ancestors of the Beaker people. Genetically, they were the polar opposite of the Stonehenge builders. While the Neolithic farmers were descended from Mediterranean migrants, the newcomers carried the steppe signature. They were taller, often possessed lighter skin and blue or green eyes, and they carried a genetic mutation that was practically a superpower in the ancient world, the ability to digest milk into adulthood. This lactose tolerance gave them a mobile, high-energy food source that their rivals simply didn't have. They brought the wheel, they brought the horse, and they brought a social structure built for expansion. But the most haunting question remained. How did 90% of a population just disappear? In a modern context, a 90% replacement is almost unthinkable. It is the genetic equivalent of every person in a nation being removed and replaced by a different ethnic group in just a few generations. Historians and geneticists began to look for the smoking gun of this ancient catastrophe. The first theory was a dark one: violent conquest. The Beaker people, with their superior copper weapons and horse-mounted mobility, may have simply overwhelmed the local farmers. But the archaeological record shows surprisingly little evidence of a massive island-wide war. There are no burned cities, no mass graves filled with arrow-riddled skeletons. The second theory is perhaps even more terrifying. Scientists began to find traces of Yersinia pestis, the plague, in the teeth of skeletons from this period. It is possible that the newcomers brought with them diseases to which the local Neolithic population had no immunity. Much like the catastrophic arrival of Europeans in the Americas thousands of years later, the original builders of Stonehenge may have been decimated by a biological invisible invader before a single sword was even drawn. As the original population succumbed to disease or social collapse, the Beaker people simply moved into the vacuum. They didn't just take the land, they took the monuments. They stood in the shadows of the great stones that they did not build, and they buried their own dead in the sacred soil surrounding them. The bloodline that raised Stonehenge was severed. The ghost of the megaliths was born, a population that had achieved the impossible only to be wiped from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but silent stones and a genetic void. Today, millions of people flock to the Salisbury Plain every year. They walk the circular path around the great trilithons, snapping photos and whispering in hushed tones about the mystery of who built this place. There is a profound sense of connection in the air, a feeling that by standing in the shadow of these stones, we are somehow reaching back across the millennia to touch the hands of our own grandfathers. We see ourselves in the stones, we see our heritage, we see our home. But the cold, hard data of the human genome tells a different story. It tells us that for the vast majority of people living in Britain and Northern Europe today, the men and women who carved, dragged, and raised these 5,000-year-old giants were not your ancestors. They were a people whose world ended so completely that they have no modern country to call their own. They were the Neolithic Britons, the people of the sun and the soil, and they are gone. When we look at the DNA of a modern person of British descent, we see a palimpsest of history. We see the heavy genetic signature of the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Romans. But beneath those layers, the foundation is almost entirely the DNA of the Bell Beaker people, the steppe-born migrants who arrived 4,500 years ago. The genetic replacement was so thorough that the original builder's code was reduced to a mere whisper. In most modern individuals, the DNA of the people who actually built Stonehenge accounts for less than 10% of their total genetic makeup. Stonehenge, therefore, is not a monument to the ancestors of the British people. It is something far more haunting. It is a massive lithic tombstone for a vanished race. It is a silent witness to a moment in time when one version of humanity was deleted and another was written over the top of it. This realization forces us to confront a terrifying truth about our own history. We like to think of human progress as a continuous thread, a relay race where the torch is passed from father to son in an unbroken line. But the Stonehenge Ghost teaches us that history is often a series of erasures. Great civilizations with their own languages, gods, and architectural genius can be wiped from the face of the earth in a heartbeat, leaving behind nothing but the stones they moved and a few stray strands of code and the blood of their conquerors. Yet there is a final enigmatic twist to this story. While the Neolithic Britons were largely replaced, they were not entirely erased. Geneticists have found that a tiny fraction of their DNA, that ghost DNA, still lingers. It is a genetic inheritance that seems to be concentrated in specific areas of the modern human brain, particularly those linked to spatial awareness and long-term memory. It is as if the people who mastered the alignment of the stars and the geometry of the earth left a small part of their cognitive map behind, tucked away in the shadows of our own minds. Perhaps that is why we feel such an unshakable pull toward these ancient ruins. We aren't looking at the work of our grandfathers. We are looking at the work of a people who were here before us, whose land we took, and whose blood we carry as a microscopic forgotten cargo. As the sun sets over the Salisbury Plain, casting long, dark shadows across the chalky earth, the stones remain. They do not care about DNA. They do not care about the rise and fall of empires or the replacement of one gene pool by another. They have watched the dark-haired farmers toil, and they have watched the golden-haired warriors take their place. They have seen the plague, the sword, and the plow. The mystery of Stonehenge was never about how they moved the stones. The mystery was always about what happened to the souls who moved them. And now, thanks to the silent testimony of our own DNA, we finally know the truth. We are walking on the graves of a lost world, and the only thing more permanent than the stones themselves is the ghost they left behind.